everybody. It's Pete Blood with Corrections Unfiltered, the podcast where corrections meets conversation. We kind of have a follow-up today. This is going to be an outstanding podcast because not only do we have Randy Davis rejoining us again, remember, he was the warden at USP Marion for a period of time, as well as another 48 years of a corrections career. But we also have Doc Michael Ahrens. And Dr. Ahrens was a psychologist who I met throughout my career at Marion. Hey, Doc, you want to kind of go through like a little brief summary of what 60 years in corrections is like?
Yeah, sure. Good morning or good afternoon, you guys, wherever you're at. The short answer, Pete, is that I spent as a psychologist, as a correctional psychologist. I was in the Bureau for a little over 24 years. Then I worked in state corrections for about 13 more years, a couple different states. So I was a psychologist all that time. Probably the most interesting, I think, at least to me, is how I became a correctional psychologist. Going way back now into the late 60s, a guy by the name of President Richard Nixon. You ever hear of him? He passed his administration. His administration passed an omnibus crime bill, and with that crime bill, they funded college programs. Police science, they were called back then. And I joined one of those, enrolled in one of those programs at university here. And when I graduated, there was a criminal justice degree then that changed from police science to criminal justice with a psychology minor. And I thought I wanted to be in the law enforcement. So I joined, took a position with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources as a conservation warden. And boy, I was a misfit for that. I wasn't a real sportsman, and hunting and fishing violations and trapping violations, it just wasn't my thing. So here I am unhappy with that position. And I said, geez, I got my college degree pretty much, undergraduate degree pretty much paid for by this crime bill. So I thought I better take advantage of it somehow. So I started to work in Colorado Department of Corrections back in, I was in the law enforcement position in the summer of 1972. Boy, that's a long time ago, isn't it? And then I went into the Colorado Department of Corrections at the Colorado State Penitentiary in February of 74. And that started my career. So I was the first cohort in a Colorado State Penitentiary of college graduates. It was like 8 of us hired on. Before that, it was all retired military pretty much, and they're all were in their mid-40s, retired from the military, and they became correctional officers, cell house technicians, and the like in the Colorado system. And then their goal was to get 2 retirements, one with the United States military and then one with the Department of Corrections. But so they hired us as the first group that was right from college. And you can imagine, as I was 22, maybe I just turned 23, working in the state penitentiary. It was the old territorial prison in Colorado down by Canyon City, where the ADX is now in that area. It was long before the ADX. So I was there a year and a half actually, and it was just a little bit too chaotic for me. So I went back to school, got my master's degree, and I worked at the #1 jail in the United States in Boulder, Colorado for 3 years. It was called the NIC, National Institute of Corrections Jail Academy. Beautiful place to work, very progressive correctional policies and practices. I was there for 3 years. And while I was there, I saw a couple guys every semester. A couple guys were there, and they were a psychologist from the University of Colorado doing research there. And I thought, boy, that'd be a pretty neat job to be a psychologist in a correctional setting. Boom, that's where I went. I applied and I got accepted in the university in a doctoral program. And I did 3 years on campus. I had to do a 2-year internship. First year of that internship was in Danbury, Connecticut. Now, Danbury, probably don't recall, but at the time, that prison housed all the Nixon staff that were arrested, incarcerated, and Watergate. So here I am. The Nixon administration gave me money to go to school to be a correctional psychologist, and here I am at an institution with that correctional institution were the Nixon administrators that arranged for this program. Sort of ironic. So then I left there and I went, my second year internship was at the Robert F. Kennedy Correctional Institution in Morgantown. Now it's not Robert F. Kennedy Jr., it was his father set up. He was an attorney general under his brother, John F. Kennedy's administration. And he had this idea, this is how prison should be, a very progressive prison, much like you might read about in Scandinavian countries, Norway and Sweden and Iceland, etc. It had a huge indoor heated swimming pool. It was co-correctional. I was there for a year. It was another eye-opening experience. And then I got my license, and then away I went. Chief psychologist at Raybrook, chief psychologist activating a prison at Mariana, chief psychologist activating a prison at McKean, came back to Oxford, Wisconsin, chief psychologist there. After a few years, I went to the Western Regional Office, administrator, regional psych administrator in the Western region. And then I got the call to see if I wanted to come to Marion to run a specialized program, and boom, that was it.
What years were you at Marion?
I came in 2000 and I retired out of Marion in 2007.
Okay. Same years I was there.
Yeah.
And
part of the time I was there.
You were just there before me, Pete.
And then Randy showed up. What time, Randy?
About 2000, into 2003, 2004, and then of course left. Yeah, retired in 2005.
Can you kind of give us an overview of what that program was?
Yeah, sure. The quick background of it is that I was at a meeting in, I don't know if you want a quick background to it all, but I was in a meeting with psychologists, and that's always a scary thing. It was probably in 1999, and they talked about implementing a program at Marion called the ECodeProgram, Enhanced Challenge Opportunity in Discipline. It was a program I think someone had developed at maybe Pollock or one of the relatively new penitentiaries there. And it was made up of different components, generally aimed at violence interruption. I didn't know a lot about the program. In fact, I didn't know anything about the program. But we were talking at this psychology meeting in Phoenix, I believe it was, and there was some notion that maybe this program could work at Marion because the executive staff was in a difficult position, at least from my perspective. And Randy might be able to add more to it because the Marion was in the north central region. I think, Randy, you were in the north central region at the time. But Marion was facing a number of issues. One was this per capita issue. It was a very expensive institution and probably the highest per capita cost in the Bureau of Prisons. Another issue they were facing was there's this groundswell that maybe, just maybe, this whole model wasn't working right. In other words, the model was you incapacitate the worst of the worst in one place, put them in a timeout for a decade or so, and somehow, some way, their behavior would change, and then they would go back to freestanding penitentiaries. And there was some evidence that this wasn't really working. And the third thing, the main thing, was a lot of litigation was coming towards Marion. It was coming from human rights organizations, inmate advocacy organizations, international organizations. If you remember way back, I think it was during the Jimmy Carter administration was pointing the finger at other countries, maybe like China and the Tiananmen Square incident, and maybe at South Africa and the Nelson Mandela issues, related issues. So we were pointing our finger at other countries, how they're treating their dissidents, lockdowns, secure confinement, lack of freedom, lack of legal rights. And they were pointing their finger back at us at Marion, which was the flagship Supermax then, they were pointing their finger back at us and saying, look at what you're doing at Marion. You're putting individuals, no due process. You're doing it in-house administratively, saying this person needs to be in a lockdown facility for 23 hours a day. And then somehow somebody makes a decision when they can leave. There was no process to get in.
Mhm.
There was no real process to get out. And so that was causing a lot of focus and media attention at Marion. And one thing we know about correctional systems, whether it's state or federal or private, you don't want a lot of media attention, at least not this kind of a media attention.
Right.
So that was the driving force behind ECode. It was a notion, was it possible to take some program and put it into Marion, which did not have any of these ongoing programs? Could we do it at Marion? And that's kind of where it all started back in 1999.
I want to jump back to that, Randy, if you don't mind, because in the previous podcast where Randy was on, we were discussing, because he was the foot on the ground soldier who was there helping out the initial litigation to justify and to sustain the Supermax concept. So after what Doc said, and we talked about in your podcast how over time things kind of changed because you have to kind of relieve some pressure from things. So from what Doc just said, how do you interpret that based upon the work you did back in the 80s?
Well, of course, when they first did it, we just locked down. There was no due process for that lockdown. We did it more of a security enhancements, try to protect staff and inmates. That's how we came across. Of course, the litigation came. We did win the lawsuit for the class action lawsuit for locking them down. But by winning that, we didn't really win anything. We won the fact that we could do that, but we were losing the war, you might say, because you always have new gang leaders and new people step up to the plate once the other ones leave. You just concentrate them all at Marion, the real bad guys, and what are you going to have? A lot of issues, fights, assaults, and those kind of things. A lot of gang activity. So I think in the long run, when I came back to Marion several different times after the initial lawsuit. The first time I was there, they had added some programs. They had tried to get some more recreation, try to get them more out of cell time, and there was some movement, but it was more of a classification type movement, not really an earned movement. That's what I noticed the first time I came back. When I came back the next time as warden, the big change I had noticed is they had 2 new housing units. Those were the housing units they were using to try to graduate them out of the facility. They started the ECodeProgram, of course, with Doc, and they had a lot of counselors and stuff through the ECodeProgram. And they were trying to work with these guys to earn their way out, to maybe kind of figure out how they ended up at Marion and how they can maybe change their lives a little bit. Some it was kind of hard since you're doing double life sentences, things like that. It's kind of hard to change your long-term perspective of that, or what you're going to do. But I think some did. I look back at that video or the video that we recently watched, where I know Doc interviewed these 2 or 3 inmates, and to hear them talk on that video, of course, some of that might have been just trying to get out of the institution, but most of them were very favorable about the ECodeProgram and said that they saw things in it and the perspective of staff that they put themselves there. They should be responsible. Now they have to work their way out. And I still wonder today if any of those guys ever made it to the street. I hope they did.
So can you kind of tell us what were the main objectives and what were the goals of the program?
Yeah, sure. The main goals weren't that lofty, Pete, at Marion. I had some program materials. The whole theme was violence interruption. As Warden Davis had said, that Marion had a lot of violence. Violent people there, violent inmates there, and a lot of violence within the institution. So the theme was, could we could we implement some form of programming to reduce the violence? The common denominator to all the inmates at Marion seemed to be violence. There was some talk about gang interruption program, like tattoo removal type stuff, gang renunciation, where they'd avow their gang affiliations, but that never really developed. I didn't want any part of that. That's not my specialty. I mean, Mexicana Me and Aryan Brotherhood, a lot of gangs were at. And I know that in penitentiary settings, if you can't control the gangs, you're not really controlling the institution. But ECODE never developed a gang involvement or anti-gang involvement component. Anyway, the theme was more towards violence interruption. There were some modules about enhancing victim empathy, modules about reshaping what a man or what masculinity is. As you know, a lot of these inmates were blind to one way, their way. The old motto, one day as a lion versus 10 days as a sheep, they were raised in this traumatic environment. You don't have to be a psychologist to know that. You could have them take their shirt off and you could see there are scars, bullet hole bites, burns. In fact, I used to, and when I did intake assessments in my career, I'd ask the participants, or I'd ask the inmates, have you ever been shot? Have you ever been stabbed? Have you ever been bit by a police dog? And all the answers seemed to be, yeah, sure, yeah, And so I had to throw something, and I would say, have you ever been burned on fire? With cocaine, freebase and cocaine and meth. A lot of them would say, yeah, I've been on fire. They just had this immense amount of trauma to themselves, and they caused an immense amount of trauma. So that's what the theme was, to see if somehow we could program our way out of that violence environment that they experienced and that they caused.
And like you said, Doc, they had all had a traumatic lifestyle prior to prison. I think the majority of them, and then they had this traumatic lifestyle once they enter prison. Some of them actually entered in lower level institutions. We're talking about lows, medium level institutions, and they kind of graduated up because of probably their personality, their need to be a part of something, maybe a gang or a group, or to be in command or control. And I saw it, and I was amazed at some of the changes, though, that I think I saw with some of the ECO. Now, not all of them, obviously not all of them, but several of them there. I saw some, I thought, wonderful changes. I think back, think, God, I wish, why couldn't we have done this prior to them coming to Marion? Why aren't we doing something similar on the streets, let's say Chicago, where before they get this far? And we're always trying to correct things after the fact. It's too bad we can't get involved before it gets that far.
Yeah. All right. So Doc, I'm really intrigued by what you talked about as far as, because of the way that you came up in the system, you really weren't a gang person. I can tell you that I was never, savvy to remembering the tattoos and the gang affiliations and all that stuff, but I tried to manage human behavior, the way they behaved. So I really respect the fact that, in your opinion, it was better for you to work on the mind, the cognitive thinking, the choices that they made, the understanding of accountability and things. I really want to dive into that real quick, if you don't mind, and especially you,
Sure.
Mr. Davis, because you were a warden who had to manage the entire show. You're the ringleader of all these different circus acts that are going on, so to speak. So how was that for you initially to say, hey, I'm not dealing with that gang stuff, that's your guys' thing, and then you honed in on the cognitive side?
Yeah, sure. I'll just point out one feature, one element. There was a notion that maybe we could do this. Maybe we could, this was someone else's idea presented to me. Maybe we could bring a group of inmates together from different gangs and have like a meeting and put the gang members in cages and move the cages, wheel the cages into the chapel area. As you remember, Warden, Marion had terrible architecture for programming, as a lot of penitentiaries, a lot of institutions do. It wasn't designed to program. So we were looking at where could we get, somebody came up with this idea, where could we get a space in Marion where we could wheel gang members in, say someone from Aryan Brotherhood, someone from Mexican, someone from Latin Kings, wheel them on in cages. And the correctional staff weren't too pleased with it. The psychology behind that is called flooding or systematic desensitization. It's used to treat anxiety disorders. If someone's anxious, you do calming techniques for them, deep breathing, count to 10, all that kind of stuff, and then move them closer to the edge and then push them off the edge. No. You move them closer to the edge and they'll somehow their fear of heights would go away. See, that's right. So the idea was, well, you get these gang members, calm them down, get them all angry at each other, and then introduce a calming technique. And somehow, some way, in some magical manner, that they would get along. And I would think, oh my God, you get them all fired up, mad at each other, threatening to kill each other, wheel them back to the cell house and open up the cages and see what happens. That was way too bizarre, way too lofty of a goal. I want nothing that's way out of psychologies. Maybe they do it at other institutions, Pelican Bay or something, or TDC, the Texas Department of Corrections, but I didn't want anything to do with that in Marion. The whole program would have ended and collapsed right there in my mind.
Before we start getting a bunch of comments on we pulled it off ourselves, this was 2000. This was at Marion, who had just come from a storied history of violence. So we're gonna make sure we want to say that, as far as somebody else might have pulled it off after that, but that's only because of the good work of Doc Ahrens.
Well, no, let's back up a second. Let me back up a second. Yeah, we're give this issue to somebody else. I know there are a lot of anti-gang initiatives in the California Department of Corrections way back in the 90s. And but we're dealing, like you said, with just the Marion issue. If I take one big step back, Randy, before you got there, when I first arrived, I had told the executive staff early on that I thought the issue was not getting inmates to program, but getting staff back program, getting staff in the program, getting staff bought in the idea. And if you remember way back, we had federal judges. My comment was, let's get the federal family involved. We had federal judges there, presentation about, hey, we're going to introduce programming here, and it's called the ECodeProgram, and these are the components of the program. So we gave presentations to federal judges. The Marshal Service was there. Over time, presentations to the Marshal Service and tours. The FBI had a couple agents assigned there. We brought them into the fold. That Marion mission was going to be changing. So we were getting the federal probation officers came in. We were getting the federal family saying, hey, there's going to be a new program going on in Marion. And then we went to the community, did presentations at community relation boards, remember the CRBs, the Lions Club. I went to the library a couple times, gave presentations in the library to community members, talking about the new program that's starting at Marion, trying to get a groundswell so that the staff who work there, the officers, because if they weren't buying the program, if they weren't getting in the program, and maybe some are watching them now, but that was the groundswell to get them into the programming. And
so, Doc, Warden Davis, so you have this situation going on. You've got a facility that has a storied history of violence. It moved into the Supermax model because of that violence. Now you've got this doctor showing up, and now he wants to get this program going. And so there's a collision going on. You've got violent inmates, staff dealing with all that violence, and now this program shows up. So what were some of the difficulties you had, the hardships you had, and how did you go about encouraging inmates to even participate? What was the end of the line for them? What was the light at the end of the tunnel?
One of the probably the main motivation one of the main motivators at Marion was out of cell time. If you join ECode, you're gonna get more time out of your cell. You can just imagine 23 hours a day for X number of years. They just needed more time out of their cells, and ECode afforded that. Second is there are some inmates there that were just sick and tired of being sick and tired, and the gangs and violence and being enmeshed in that lifestyle, just sick and tired of it. Whether they wanted to get an ECode to change their ways, or whether they wanted to get an ECode to get out of the Marion mess they got themselves in, didn't really matter to me. I just wanted to get them in the program. It was sort of like, I think of like a preacher. Preacher doesn't really care who, I don't think. So maybe they do, maybe they don't. But they just want the person to show up in church. Sit in the pew. While you're sitting in the pew, maybe something will happen. Just come to church. Maybe something will happen. Doesn't have to be an epiphany, but maybe you become a better person. I had the same kind of notion too. Just come to ECode groups. Just come to an individual counseling session. Just come in a role-playing session. Just come to some triad and I'll explain how it all works session. Maybe something good will happen. It certainly beats sitting in the cell all day long, and it certainly helps us so they're not sitting in the cell sharpening a piece of metal. So that was kind of the motion and the motivation. Just get them in. Just get in the program for now. Now, one thing we did do, and I remember, is that all people, doesn't have to be inmates, but all people have referent power. They just have people gravitate for them. It might be because of formal power, maybe because they're a captain or a lieutenant or a sergeant or a warden or a social warden. Other people just have this informal power. And there were inmates at Marion. They might not have been the gang leader, but they had some informal power. And I worked with probably you or some lieutenants and some of the other ECode staff about identifying those inmates that we thought had a lot of institutional power, a lot of institutional moxie. And if we could find those who wanted to get in the program, they could lead others. Now, this is an old belief that I had, and others have it too, I think, maybe not, maybe. But I think even high security inmates are like sheep. I mean, I wouldn't go up to someone and say, you're a freaking sheep, but they have that kind of mentality. You get them going, head in the right direction, a couple good sheepdogs, get them in the right direction. There's this herd mentality, flock mentality, somehow part of human nature that people will go the same way. So we got a few of these gems that they had a lot of referent power, they had a lot of say, and we got them into the program. And that once they got into the program, they pulled a few with them. Now, I'm still of the belief that some inmates were ordered into the program and some inmates were ordered not to get in the program. Maybe I'm going way off of my bounds, but that was always my belief. But we monitored the participation rates, how many groups you're having, how many inmates in the groups, how long were the groups, how many individual sessions. We started off with cell front sessions right in front of the cells, and we graduated to come into my office, come into the 5 or 6 other ECodeProgram offices, the chapel without the steel cages. We use that as a group room. And it just over time, nothing happened quick. There was no urgency, no hurry, nothing happens quick in prison. And we're talking about a few years, just got the ball moving, and then the numbers went up and up, and the institution, from my perspective, now it's biased, of course, but from my institution seemed a little bit safer, a little bit less chaotic, a little bit normalized, and it reduced something that you never want in a penitentiary, never want in a Supermax penitentiary, is this dehumanization to happen. When you just don't have human interaction with inmates, they're just numbers. They're just always behind their cell. You can really get a dehumanizing kind of environment, and then bad stuff happens. But as inmates started to get out, a normal human interaction between guards, between case managers, between lieutenants, between between ECode staff. It got a little bit more normalized from my perspective. Now, well, I'll leave it right at that.
I agree. I definitely agree personally. Back when before the lockdown and before we started putting all the inmates, I remember as an officer the way you dealt with inmates, and actually it wasn't bad. You had friendly conversations. You dealt with them totally different. After we locked down, then it became more of a battleground, us against them. And I did see when I came back an improvement in those areas, especially of those guys who were down in those pre-transfer units, those I guess called ECode units, but they were. I was more comfortable walking down there and more comfortable talking to them. Not that we still didn't have issues, because we did occasionally. I looked at that guy in that video that I watched recently. That was an Iron Man Jennings. It seemed like what a change. Yeah, and again, I'm not sure that was all real, but I felt like it was. He got me sewed.
Well, I met him later
he was
on.
trying to make some changes.
I met him 2010. He was at a penitentiary that I was assigned to as an associate warden. And he talked from behind me. I'm like, I remember that voice. And I turn around and look, and there he is, a guy I never thought I'd see without being in restraints or without being behind the door. And Doc, he said it was the ECode program. He said that for 30 years of his life, that people were telling him he was the problem. And of course, he said he wasn't the problem. And after a while, and hearing you talk and saying, why don't you try the ECode program? He did. His motivating factor was he wanted to get out of the Supermax into an open yard so maybe he could visit his mother before she passed. So that's why when I was asking, they all have maybe a different reason to do it. They want to get out of a gang. They want to see their mother, they whatever. Like you said, you had to find something that you could make tangible for them to work towards. And when they got it, the reward definitely had to be there. Because if you took that reward away, then everybody else is going to fall apart because no one's going to believe the system is actually in place.
Yeah, I remember him. He and a few others were like good recruiters for the ECode program.
Right. If a program can take one inmate who's not behaving and make him behave, that's a much better day for the correctional officer. And if you can take the Marion concept, the top tier of the problematic inmates, and you can take some of those inmates off of that behavioral pattern, you've just made, the mainline facilities, even that facility, less violent, which starts taking a lot of that stress away.
Right.
So Doc, what were some of the challenges that you had as far as like continuing the path to make sure if you had people who didn't make it, that had to be a setback, because they go back to cell house, they're not going to make it about them. They're going to make it about the program. So when you started, if you did lose somebody, how did you guys go and recover from that to keep your momentum going, pick that back up again?
Yeah, we had some programming starts and stops, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But we had a commitment. And a commitment came from the associate warden and the warden, and we just kept offering programming. And some inmates dropped out. Some inmates, I don't know. It's hard to measure the programming intent. Clearly, and Randy, you had said this in the beginning of this podcast, that it's hard to measure the motivation. It's almost referred to it as a selection bias. Why is the inmate in the program? But it seemed for the majority of them, Pete, it seemed once they got in and felt reasonably comfortable that they could go back to their cell house, they could go back and interact with other inmates and not be ostracized or stabbed or beat up. Once there was past that safety issue, that they stayed in the program. Yeah. We had a process for them that Randy, you had made reference to it, like an honor unit. I don't know how much of an honor it was, but there was more privileges in that unit, that once they got in, they could see a tangible goal. And once they stayed in, they could work towards that tangible goal. I always thought if the institution, if Marion had a different architectural design, it could have been much more successful. And what I mean is that all the cells were pretty much the same until they added on to Marion. But if we had some cells that were bigger, some cells that had more light, if some of those cells had air conditioning, and we could use that as a motivating factor, as a real step down unit, that they could feel a bunk, feel a bed, have a light switch, have a window that might open a little bit, those kind of tangible elements, and air conditioning. We know how it was in summer in Southern Illinois. If we had if the architecture would allow and permit some of that stuff, that the E-code would have been much, I thought, much more beneficial.
Right.
We were working, E-code was working within an institutional setting that was real restrictive. I told somebody at some community relations board meeting was, just think for a moment. You're in a high school. We all been in high school. We all know what a high school looks like. We know teachers. We know the janitors. We know the school nurse. We remember all that. Just think for a moment. If I went into high school administration and said, we're changing this high school into a maximum security prison. The buses are coming next week, 300 inmates, 3 buses, 300 inmates. You change from a high school to a high security penitentiary. Can you imagine the chaos that would be? Can you imagine locks, windows, javelin in the fire department, shot put in the fire department? Nobody knows anything about keys. Nobody knows anything about accountability. Nobody knows anything about lockdown. Nobody knows anything about stun gun munitions. Inmates it would be crazy. It would be uncontrollable, right?
Yeah.
And now flip it over. Now we're saying, let's take an educational program and put it in the high security prison. We have no group room. We have no audiovisual equipment, and we have no place to plug in a TV camera or a video recorder or nothing. We didn't even have a control a light switch. We had a contact center, the control center. Can you turn on the light switch? Can you turn the light switch off? Can you open this door? Can you open that door? It took forever. Marion was, it was so cumbersome to move inmate from one place to another place. It was like an airport traffic controller. You had to lock this door and lock that door and make sure this inmate wasn't with this inmate. This inmate had to sit on the boss chair. This inmate had to be cell searched before he left, before he came back. It took forever to get inmates moving. It took a long time to get everybody kind of working together in this institution that was never, ever designed for a program. Now, when the new cell houses opened, when you got there, Randy, what was that, 83 or no, 2003?
2003.
That gave us a little bit of leeway. That helped because that was air conditioned, but it was double cell. But it gave us a little bit of working room. But that was like 3.5 years down the road.
Right. Yeah. Such a long time after they started the program. It took that long. But I thought that was a good thing, though. At least they advanced that far.
Yeah,
but you still had
a process maybe, but it was
still hard to move an inmate. Still hard moving an inmate out of there. Still very difficult. That's the part about a high security operation, especially at that level, high security. It's always a problem. Everything's always a problem when it comes to inmate movement, dealing with them. That's why it takes so many staff to operate it. And of course, that's why you don't want a whole lot of inmates in that kind of setup, because you don't have the funding or the money to operate those kind of lockdowns. That's where I think they were hoping that these programs and stuff would put more people out in general populations and less in the high security facilities. And maybe that's worked, because I know they don't have a lot at the ADX. They don't have a lot of inmates there. They're at
you've got that 1963 model prison setting, which was designed after Alcatraz, which was designed for whatever years. So you had the same locking mechanisms, the same small hallways, the same small entrances and exits. But then you had that mindset of slow movement. Don't get too many people too close to each other because they'll feed off each other. Things can go bad. It just takes one person to get out of their handcuffs and your whole day changes. You have that. And then you drop in 2 brand new cell houses, right? Which doesn't change the mindset of the staff. They just see a bigger problem now.
Right.
And then you've got a new program coming in that says, hey, we're going to try to work with these minds and make them all better. It was a collision of a lot of things at that period of time, if you ask me.
Yeah, a lot of changes. Just historically, when Marion was, Marion was an open facility, was an open institution. We used to call for rec, and every housing unit in the general population went to recreation at the same time.
Wow.
We're talking about all of them. And we had putt golf. We had racquetball courts and basketball courts and all that. It was on the yard. I worked there during those period of time. Worked there as an officer on the yard with 400 inmates out on the yard. But when we changed the classification system, where we started putting all the worst of the worst, and why they picked Marion was because it was small. It was a secure but small facility because they didn't think they were going to need that much space. Of course, it changed, and then when that changed, we graduated to, of course, at the end of October of '83, to where we were, of course, when you got there, Doc and Pete, where it was more secure and locked down, and you couldn't let these inmates get close to these inmates, and it was. It was not the best situation, and I don't think the classification set up when they decided to put them all there, that was not a real workable. You can't put all your bad apples together because they all get rotten. That's just it.
Well, the original model was when they completed ECode, they'd go to a mainline penitentiary, and that facility would have an ongoing program. So they would slide into that program and be with others that were already bought into an institutional programming model. But I don't think that happened. Maybe you know more than I do, but I don't think that really happened. Some of these institutions didn't have these ongoing programs as a normal linkage to ECode. They're going to different regions, different.
Yeah, there's a few institutions I think had it, as I recall, but one of the problems they ran into because of gang affiliation and things like that, they may have not been able to go to that facility. Yeah. So there you go. That we sent them to a facility that they could not actually participate. So, Doc, I got one question for you. During your career there, you spent some hard years there, creating that program and kind of hopefully advancing it, making it a better program as the years went on. What do you have anything that really makes you feel good about it that happened, or any particular success cases that when you think about the whole thing, you think, wow, maybe I did make some changes or had some positive,
I'll go out on a limb and answer that. It seems very boastful or narcissistic, but I've often thought of, I suspect there's at some point early on, maybe even before ECode, maybe in the initial meetings, discussions about Marion, I think there might have been some thought about closing Marion, closing it completely. And that would have been devastating for the Marion community in Southern Illinois. But I think in my mind, I always thought in my mind that they might close Marion.
Right.
And with ECode, with programming, and it started programming that showed the executive staff that programming could be done at Marion, could be done with the architectural limitations, could be done with the staff, could be done with the culture. And that took a step forward where they developed the sex offender management program at Marion. Remember, those 2 new cell houses opened up, money poured into Marion, and it changed the mission to a sex offender programming institution. Can you imagine that? Could you imagine that in 2000, that in the course of 6-7 years that they'd be doing sex offender programming at Marion? Hell no. So I think in a way, this is I'm long gone, long out of the business, but I think in a way, ECode might have saved Marion. Isn't that a boastful statement? Because of the
No,
programming,
I can see that.
programming going. I think so. I think if it would have blown up, I think if Marion would have blown up for whatever reason, that they would have just shut the whole damn thing down, and ADX was already up and open and running. I think they would have moved them all over to the ADX and close the institution. I really do.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think that's probably true because I mean, Marion was an expensive place to operate. It was small footprint, small number of inmates that we could house at the time. Here they built a new Supermax, more operating, and I think they got smart. I think the ECodeProgram helped them kind of think, well, we can still use this institution as a program in the institution, even though it was old with the bar fronts and all that, it still operated good. I mean, it still, it didn't make sense to go build a brand new place when you already got one right there. And I think that probably did help.
Yeah. Now, the downside to the ECodeProgram, and I see it, one major downside, one major flaw I had, you look at the drug program in the Bureau of Prisons or let's say the drug program. Remember RDAP, Residential Drug Program? That was a big program. And in that program, they had a component, National Institute of Drug Abuse, that was within the Bureau of Prisons. And they monitored all the inmates that completed RDAP across time and across settings. A lot of those got out of the institution, of course, went through halfway houses, residential treatment in the community, and they monitor them to see the program effectiveness. I never had that. I never developed that. So these inmates completed ECode and they went whatever. There was no tracking system. It wasn't like we're looking at recidivism. We were just looking at whether they're involved in future assaults, stabbings, acts of violence at other institutions. That was never monitored, never tracked, from my knowledge.
Yeah.
And so
we had to follow them individually.
I never saw it. So I never got any real feedback of whether they internalized what they learned, or was it all just playing the game for all of them? Right. I never knew.
I'm glad the program was there. I'm glad that the personalities were there, like Doc Ahrens. He had some good staff too. He had some good counselors who I think really did care about making some changes with the inmates and hoping to make some positive stuff. Were we successful? The operation, I don't know. There was a lot less murders than there was previous. So maybe that was maybe that's the guidepost or the the thing saying that whether it was successful or not. We didn't have as many staff assaults. We didn't have any staff inmate murders and things like that. So maybe it was a positive thing. Inmates left. I hope a lot of them didn't come. Now I know some of them came back, but a lot of them I never saw again.
Well, Doc, so if I want to wrap this up, I want to ask you this question: is if you could, because I truly believe you were the right man for the job. You developed a team that was the right team for that place. I believe that you went through the hurdles and you got past all the challenges that the infrastructure set up, that the staff mindset set up, and everything. What advice if you were told, hey, Doc, we've got this prison, it's a Supermax, and we want to implement a program to help change the cognitive thinking. If you could sit down with that group of staff who's going to launch that at that facility, what's the advice you would give them?
I think it's a good thing, but probably for the wrong reasons. The good thing in the sense that it's just good to have programming in institutions, whether high max, low max. It's just a good thing. It's the American way. It keeps from getting involved in dehumanizing other human beings. It's just the right thing. It doesn't. I think at best it has modest effects. I think it's probably money that one could say isn't well spent, but it's just the right thing to do in terms of, does it rehabilitate? Does it change, a lifelong change for inmates, that's a big reach from those inmates that are in penitentiary settings. So I'm coming across with a real cynical, jaded, inimical kind of a perspective. That's part of working in the prison environments, that it is just hard to change human beings. But despite that, I think it's still the right thing to do, is to do programming. Well, it's drug abuse program, religious program, vocational program, educational program. It might not have the impact, and I think it doesn't have the impact that some people say it does, but it's just the right thing to do.
Randy, you want to talk about that?
I disagree with that. I agree with that so much. I think it's even good for the people that work there.
Yeah.
That to see that there's some kind of program. Otherwise, you become so harsh and hard when you're not there. So I think it's very positive.
For me, when I promoted, because after your experience, Doc, me working with you and seeing how you did your business and understanding the importance of it, I went to be a captain, and I was touching on programming, but I just really wasn't over there. When I became an AW, it was brought when I became an AW, it was brought right to my attention that my failure to support it is why the programming wasn't going to work. I had to change my mindset, and luckily there was an RDAP coordinator who just would not let up on me, and she was just telling me, you need to be down here for the graduation, you need to shake their hands, you need to tell them they did a good job, you need to come do the unit inspections. And she would drag me down there to do it. And then I had a chance to finally open up my brain and realize the importance that my role played in being supportive of that. And then if it made one inmate better that day, then that was a better day for a correctional officer somewhere.
Yep. Well said.
Thanks. I don't know if it'll make the podcast, but I'm glad I said it to you, because you're a very important figure in my correctional experience. I've worked, if you total it all up, 12, 13 facilities. You're the only Doc Ahrens I've ever met.
Thanks, Pete.
Hey, so Dr. Ahrens, thank you for coming on the show today. It's been a great conversation. Randy, thank you so much, sir, for coming back on. We're bringing this whole full circles. Now we've talked about how Marion started. Now we got the programming going, and you were such an integral part and an important member of my corrections career. So, Doc, thank you so much. Randy, thank you so much for being here.
All right.